Could mortgage interest rates hit 15% again just because of your parents? Well, these economists say yes, and it's not just that the COVID era is behind us. Some YouTubers are talking about how the era of cheap money is over, and they put it all down to your parents, the baby boomer generation. But is that really true? Could mortgage interest rates go up to 7%, 9%, even 15%? Well, in this video, you're going to learn why some people think that interest rates could skyrocket and if the era of cheap money is over. But first, let's see why this theory makes sense, and then I'll show you the country where this theory totally failed. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. I'm Ed, an economist and property investor at Opes Partners. And the reason that some people believe the end of cheap interest rates is coming is based on the grey wave theory. You see, after World War II, birth rates across most of the Western world absolutely skyrocketed in what we now call the baby boom. Now, what's mum and dad got to do with higher interest rates? Well, the boomers spent decades saving. They were frugal with money and they built up wealth. A lot of wealth. And that flooded investment markets with cash. So the banks can then lend out that cash to people like you and me for our mortgages. Now, if the same number of people want to buy houses, but there are way more people wanting to lend out money, in this case the boomers, then the supply of money is up and demand is flat. So interest rates, they come down. But all those baby boomers, they're getting older now. So what happens when they all decide to go skiing, which we all know stands for spending the kids' inheritance? Well, they stop saving. They start spending, and all of a sudden there's less money for the banks to lend out to people like you and me. Now, in this case, you've got less supply of money, you've got flat demand, so interest rates start to rise. And it's not just fringe YouTubers making this argument. Researchers have been warning about this theory, the grey wave theory, for over 35 years. Even back in 1989, this American gerontologist, Dr. Ken Deichtweild, could see that the baby boomers would strain the economy as they started eventually getting pensions, having expensive health issues, and moving from saving to spending. Harry Dent, another economist, he took that idea even further, and he argued that demographics are destiny. Today, he's now warning that share prices could fall 90%, blaming the grey wave theory. And he said that if there are fewer workers because Aunt Mavis and Uncle Owen are trading work for windsurfing now, well, that large group of people doesn't fuel the economy as workers like they once did. Now, as a property investor, I benefit from low interest rates and gradually rising house prices. And so I wanted to know if these opinions, if these theories, the grey wave theory, are more than just opinions. Could it be reality? And here's what I found. But just before we get to that, if you want to always stay up to date with the latest interest rates, my friend and colleague Peter Norris writes an interest rate report every single month, and it shows you the secret rates that banks are offering behind the scenes. Now, if you want to get on the list for free, the link is down in the description. It takes just 30 seconds to get on that list. So the grey wave theory, it sounds about right. But is there a way to test if it's true? Because sometimes things that sound right turn out to be wrong, and sometimes things that sound wrong can actually turn out to be right. And Japan gives us the perfect natural experiment. I mean, this country is ahead of its time, not just in terms of tech, but also in demographics, because its population is already aging, and it's the picture of where we could be heading here in New Zealand. Currently, over 1 in 10 people in Japan are aged 80 or over, and nearly 1 in 3 are over 65. I mean, it might surprise you to learn. Japan is now the oldest population in the world. So if the theory about baby boomers living it up large, spending their money and raising interest rates in the process, if that's all true, well, we should already see that happening in Japan. And actually, it's kind of the opposite. Japanese interest rates have been close to zero for over 30 years. And that's because as people get older, they stop working. And when people stop working, there are fewer workers, the labour force starts shrinking. And if there are fewer workers, it's hard to produce lots of stuff and grow the economy. So what does the Japanese central bank do in response? They keep interest rates low rather than high. They're trying to stimulate the economy, increase investment, and get the economy back on track. Now, the bank didn't just do that because baby boomers are retiring, but one major study found that at least 40% of Japan's real interest rate falls since the 1980s have come from its aging population, not despite it. Now, of course, Japan is not New Zealand or America. America is not Japan, neither is New Zealand. There are differences, but Japan does give us a window into what our future could look like. And that example should make you ask, is that chain of thinking that baby boomers spend their investments, there's less money to lend out, that means higher interest rates, is that the right economic story? Because when I was at Waikato University studying economics, one of my lecturers always used to talk about what he and a lot of people call economic stories. These are the neat little packages, the cause and effect narratives that us economists always come up with, like the grey wave theory. But you can also come up with competing economic stories. So yes, you could come up with an argument that baby boomers spend their money and that causes interest rates to go up. But you could also look at the Japanese example and say, well, baby boomers quit work, fewer workers, that means there's going to be a slower economy, less demand, less investment. That means the Reserve Bank has to come out and lower interest rates. So it's the same economic event. Baby boomers getting old, but you've got two different economic stories that lead to two very different predictions. And that's where economists can split into two very different camps. Those who think that baby boomers will drive interest rates up, and then there are those, like the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, who just released this paper arguing that the grey wave would actually put downward pressure on where interest rates are heading, at least in the near term. And the economic story they're telling is that baby boomers have always been frugal. They might not spend their money as quickly. They might keep it invested for longer. And the real challenge in all of this is figuring out, of all of the 10,000 possible economic stories we could tell ourselves, which one is right when it comes to the grey wave and interest rates? How do we figure out what to believe? And that's the point where I like to zoom right out and not think about what will happen in 10 or 20 years, but ask ourselves, what's happening today? Because in New Zealand, around 900,000 people are aged 65 or older, and over 2/3 of those people are baby boomers. In fact, 68% of baby boomers are already at retirement age. Now, be honest with me. Have you noticed anything change? I mean, interest rates, yeah, they've shot up. But is any serious economist saying that's because of the retirees? Most people would say, well, that's because the government overspent during the COVID pandemic. The Reserve Bank, they kept interest rates too low for too long. So the cost of living jumped, and that inflation meant the Reserve Bank had to jack up interest rates to get that cost of living under control, get that inflation under control. Now, if you look at all of the serious economic commentary at the time, what caused interest rate rises? Was it granny spending up large on the ski field? Or was it the COVID hangover and the cost of living crisis? So how is it that the majority of Kiwi baby boomers are already in retirement, but no one's talking about them causing interest rates to go up? Well, it turns out that when retirees stop working, they don't cash in their entire Kiwi save, spend it all on day one. In fact, a report just came out from the Retirement Commission that pointed out that over half of Kiwis, they use a maintenance strategy with their money once they hit retirement. So they tend to live off the returns of their money and only spend the original capital in emergencies. So it's very unlikely that all of a sudden, baby boomers start spending up large in a way that creates this big system-wide risk where interest rates suddenly shoot up. And that brings us to a really important reality about economists, which is that our predictions are often wrong. I mean, if I take you back to 1989, there was this pair of very well-respected American economists, Mankiw and Weil, and they were sure that house prices would crash in the 1990s. In fact, they forecast that house prices would fall once Generation X started buying houses, and that by 2007, real house prices would be down almost 40%. Instead, house prices shot up. But these kinds of misses didn't just happen in the States. Over here in New Zealand, around 2009, Bob Hargraves, he's a former professor at Massey University, he was warning about a potential baby boomer housing bust. And as the first wave of baby boomers started getting the pension, maybe downsizing their houses because they didn't need as much space, He sounded the alarm in saying, hey, look, I think this is going to cause house prices to crash. And that sounded reasonable because we'd just gone through the GFC. Property prices had just fallen by around 10%. But over the next 15 years, they started taking off again. They went up. House prices didn't fall. In fact, from 2010 through to the mid-2020s, prices doubled in most of our major cities. Now, you might say to me, oh, Ed, that's because we had loose tax rules that favoured property investment. Or, Ed, that's because there was a Christchurch earthquake, so perhaps people moved out of Christchurch and bought houses elsewhere. That caused the house prices to go up. You could come up with pretty much any economic story you like. Now, my point is, though, I'm not saying that baby boomers have no impact on interest rates. I'm not even trying to tell you that the grey wave theory is wrong, that baby boomers spending their savings. Look, it could place upward pressure on interest rates. But my point is that upward pressure, as economists like to call it, can be overridden by the downward pressure of those baby boomers leaving the workforce or any other economic shock that could come along out of nowhere. And according to one landmark study from the Bank of England, global real interest rates have been falling steadily for over 700 years. So when someone says the era of cheap money is over, I always ask, compared to what? If you're talking sub 3% mortgages that came from the COVID era, where people were borrowing and spending and interest rates got as low as possible because the Reserve Bank pulled some levers, then I'd say, yeah, that era is absolutely over. What about sub 4% interest rates on mortgages? Well, if there was another big economic downturn or the fear of it, then yeah, those could potentially come back depending on what's happening in the economy, but I wouldn't count on it in the near future. Sub 5%, we're already there. So is cheap money dead? Well, it kind of depends on what cheap money means to you. In the long run, demographics, they probably pull interest rates down. In the short run, shocks like the hangover from a pandemic or an oil crisis on the other side of the world, those can push them up. And if you want to know how these interest rates impact house prices and where they're heading next, check out this video where I dig into the science of whether house prices will go up in 2025.